Welcome to David Galata Book Dreamer. I'm David Galata and I'm dreaming up books. I'm here near the below decks. Just wanted to end up working out some of the background material for my science fiction novels. Now, most of my science fiction novels are based in the same universe, the same world system, as they say. That would include Crew of Ganges, which began the whole thing. This is the first book. And right now, I've got the first trilogy done, and I'm almost done with the second book of the second trilogy that's based on this. And I also have a short story book, Tales from the Age of Unity, which is kind of a prequel to this. It's some interesting things in there, some good Easter eggs for those who like it. I have heard that as a prequel, for people who haven't read the trilogy, it's still pretty good. People have been enjoying the short stories and then diving into Crew of Ganges, so that's always nice to hear. But there are questions. There are questions that have not been fully answered. I have a lot of background material for my world system. It's one of my things. I love world building. I really enjoy it. I mean, Clockmaker, which is one of my fantasy books, and that's this lovely piece here, is also an exercise in world building. But for the Crew of Ganges and for every tale that follows that in my science fiction works, I have a very large, stable system in place where I've planned out the whole history. Now, if you go back to some of my earlier videos, you will note that I mentioned some of these things, such as world building and how to create a more rich environment for your stories and for your characters. And I've done that. And that's why I speak about it. Don't speak about things you haven't done. That's a bad idea. right off the bat, that's a bad idea. So one of the things that ends up being mentioned quite often is the idea of the Terran Conglomerate. Now, what was the Terran Conglomerate? It is mentioned not as often as the Awakening, and we'll be getting to that, but it is attached to the Awakening. So the Terran Conglomerate, what was the Terran Conglomerate? The first thing you have to understand is in Crew of Ganges, we are talking 4,000 years in the future. They are light years away from the Sol system, and they haven't dealt directly with the Terran Conglomerate since, for thousands of years. It's been a very, very long time. They haven't heard from home. So all they have are little histories and little legends and, tales and myths. So they don't really know, the crew don't really know much about the Sol system and how it was organized during the time of launch. During the time of launch, the Earth was divided into 9 nations that were called the Terran Conglomerate. This was a way of staving off very, very destructive wars. And one of the things that had happened was in this history system, now understand this about creating, before I continue, before I go on, let us understand something. Like many authors, I do not necessarily agree with, nor am I a proponent of any of the things that I write. Just because I've written something doesn't mean I want to live there. Just because I said, I can kind of see this happening doesn't mean I think it's a good idea. Please keep that in mind when you're reading someone else's work. These are works of fiction. They are what-ifs. And some of those what-ifs are very dystopian and very unpleasant. And, that's part of storytelling, okay? Just because you speak about some horrible, wizard or something like that, that's what you want to be. No, no, nothing could be further from the truth. Okay, but it makes for an interesting story. Ah, there we go. Makes for an interesting story. All right, so let me continue. The Terran Conglomerate arose because there were issues between some of the first world nations where there were economic collapses. There were all kinds of skirmishes between smaller nations, whether they were third world nations, second world nations, whatever we like to call them today. And in an attempt to make things more stable, several large nations decided to take over all of the lesser nations. In order to prevent certain nations from making inroads into certain continents, groups of nations got together. So what do you have? You have, first off, the North American New Republic. That included Canada and Mexico. It includes the United States. None of them call themselves that during the time of the Terran Conglomerate. They are the North American New Republic. You also have the South American Confederacy, which included the entire continent of South America. There was Oceania, which included India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Australia, New Zealand, Madagascar. Those were all part of what was called Oceania. There was the African bloc, which was the entire African continent. The European Parliament, which was all of Europe, including half of Russia, and the Pan-Asian bloc, which was basically China, parts of Russia, Korea, Japan. They had all been isolated into these large nations. And then there was the Antarctic Collective. The Antarctic Collective came from try to terraform Antarctica in order to perfect terraforming techniques to be used on Mars and other colonies on, say, Ganymede or Titan or Europa, and on the lunar surface itself. Part of what the Terran, there was also, whoops, I forgot one. I forgot one, actually I forgot two of them. Another one was called the Caliphate, which was most of the Middle East had become one nation that ran along the laws of Islam. So Sharia law was the way, and they had collected themselves into a single strong nation, highly technological, very advanced. And then there was the AI solidarity. The AI solidarity included all artificial intelligences. They became their own nation. And they worked with the other human nations to try to keep things stable. The problem was that the 8 human nations of the Terran Conglomerate hated each other. They didn't like each other. They were constantly competing with each other. They were constantly saber rattling. And the AIs were one of the nations that was trying to keep the humans from destroying the entire planet because they were living here too. And they didn't want to see the humans destroy everything, so they were trying to keep the humans very stable. This 9-bodied government at this point had taken over the planet. And they decided to carve up the rest of the solar system amongst themselves. They took over Luna, the moon, and divided that into a patchwork of colonies representing each of the nations of the Terran Conglomerate. When they moved out toward Mars, they did the same thing. They tried to terraform Mars 3 times. After the first major failure, that's when they went back to the Antarctic Collective and ran their experiments there. And that is when the Antarctic Collective became a major power within the Terran Conglomerate. Antarctica was basically under domes. It had been a lot of under ice and underground facilities. They basically carved that continent from the inside out in order to make it habitable and to make rich farmlands. From there, they spread out to the Jovian moons, the moons of Saturn, even the asteroid belt. There were plenty of large asteroids as well as small ones that could easily support colonies as long as they were using Antarctic collective technology. You see, you're beginning to see how those guys were really ferreting into everything. These colonies had their allegiances to any one of the Terran Conglomerate government nations, but were not permitted by Terran Conglomerate decree from forming their own nation. So Mars, if it tried to secede from the Terran Conglomerate, would find itself facing not one fleet, but 9 of them. That's a little daunting. That was just too much for them to deal with. Even with all of this, resources were still limited. They were mining the asteroids like crazy, and at first it was a big boom, it was a big economic boom. And so the human population of the Terran Conglomerate got very comfy with it, because obviously it seemed to work. The asteroids were filled with mineral and metal wealth beyond their wildest dreams. The colonies became highly populated as long as they maintained their allegiance to one or more of the Terran Conglomerate nations. However, after a while, resources are finite, and there were difficulties in maintaining control over these overburdened colonies. This was when the Ganges project was first initiated. Ganges is divided as a generation ship, 560 kilometers long, 20 kilometers in width, big spear-shaped thing with a giant ice cap at the front, was built by the Ceres Juno facility in the asteroid belt. There was no way to build this thing on a planetary surface and launch it. That's impossible. It's too huge. It was going to be difficult enough to get the thing to move because of its mass. However, each of the wheels that spin to create a form of artificial centrifugal gravity, they call it apparent gravity. Each of these wheels was in charge of a sector, and each sector represented a necessity for running the ship. There was engineering sector, obviously. There were the 2 harbors for harbor sector. There was stellar sector, which was the sciences. There was planetary sector involved in terraforming. There were these 4 agro wheels for agro sector, which was a very powerful sector. Medical sector, command sector. All of these sectors, each one of them was run by one of the members of the Terran Conglomerate, so that no one nation had an overabundance of power over the others. They all had to rely on each other, although they maintained their separate governments within those wheels. This was the condition of Ganges at launch. 3 terraformed planets later, there was what's called the Awakening, an officers' mutiny, where the officers wanted to turn the ship around, go back to the Terran Conglomerate, and forget this project. It was just terrible. Ganges became a dystopia on the inside. Nothing was working right. The AI Naga was beside itself because it didn't have any backup except for the human crew that worked with it. The rest of the solidarity wasn't there, just the one AI. And the humans were constantly stabbing each other in the back. There were very strict regulations, very horrible, strict corporal punishments for even the smallest of infractions, and the officers presented a mutiny. This mutiny was quelled by the non-officers of the ship who did not want to go back to the Terran Conglomerate. They wanted nothing to do with these guys. And so the mutiny became a civil war. After the Civil War, Ganges continued to move forward and create new worlds. But by their fifth planet, they were getting really odd messages from Terra. They were getting strange requests from the Sol system and threats. And so it was decided that there was an error in their main antennas and transmitters, and so they would disassemble them. And from that point on, Ganges was cut off from the Sol system, even though it continued on its journey of creating new terraformed planets for future colonists. So that's just a brief little history of the Terran Conglomerate and how it was organized in some of the background material for my work. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm thinking of doing more of these. And if you like it, please drop a comment and let me know. Subscribe. And if you have any comments or questions, please put them in the comments area below. And yeah, I will get back to you. Yes, I will. Thank you all to everyone who has subscribed to this channel and who have liked and watched these videos. It really, really helps me out. It makes me feel good. Thank you very much. All right, everyone. I'll see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading, everyone.